All right, here we go with chapter 8, the Caro-Kann defense, the fourth most popular defense against 1e4. How are you doing, Jesse?
I'm doing great. I am excited to look at the Caro-Kann because it is an opening that is near and dear to our hearts. We have the Caro-Kann repertoire on chess goals, and we're going to see how to refute our own opening. No, really, we only overlap in maybe a line or two. So we'll get kind of give you and the lines we recommend are pretty offbeat anyway, so you're not going to be seeing them in your games too often. It's tempting just to look at this whole chapter from Black's perspective because I like playing the Caro so much. But let's see what we're going to do against the Caro. So the Caro kind is stapled by the moves e4, c6, and kind of anything can happen from here. Just like the French, we're going to recommend the advanced Caro-Kann. So if you remember the French after d4, we're going to play e5, and we're going to play e5 as well here. Um, we're already at a bit of a branch, so there's really two moves here: Bishop f5 and c5. Caro-Kann course, we recommend c5, but it's not as common as Bishop f5. So let's look at Bishop f5. It's actually considerably less popular than Bishop f5. So let's look at Bishop f5, and we get to play a fun move kind of already off the bat here, and that is h4. So why h4 here, Matt?
Yeah, Black wants to get their bishop out to f5 safely, followed by e6 and c5. So they would like a French defense with their bishop outside of the pawn chain. What we do by playing h4 is we actually make it a bit uncomfortable for this bishop because we're threatening to sometimes trap the bishop, right? So, like, if it were our move after e6, for example, we could play g4, and all of a sudden that bishop doesn't have any good squares, right? So that's something that black has to keep in mind. And the way I found these lines for white, or settled on them, I should say, is I've played the Caro-Kann on and off my whole chess career from the black side. I used to play the bishop f5 lines. Now I play the c5 lines on move 3. And I tried to think, what are the least comfortable lines that I did not want to face from the black side? And it was this exact variation against bishop f5. On to h4, not very comfortable. So here we're going to look at two lines, h6 and h5, the more popular line being h5. So we're going to start with this, and I think this is the stronger move of the two.
Yep, I agree. And one thing that's nice about h4 too is that it's not like a bad move. It's actually a pretty good move, and it holds our advantage. So that's another benefit as well. So after h5, let's just trade off the bishops, shall we? Bishop d3, and they're pretty much always going to take. We don't even have a branching point. If they move back anywhere, we're just going to take them, and we're in a much better position. So bishop takes d3. We'll take with our queen. And again, almost always you're going to see e6 here. And we're going to uh, take our opportunity to develop with a tempo here. So bishop g5 hitting the queen.
And one thing to note here is we have a big advantage on the king side. So kind of similar to the French defense chapter, we have the queen pointing at the king side and this weak pawn on h5. Most often, black will look to castle queen side in those lines. So keep that in mind. Even though we traded off the bad bishop for black, their light square bishop in, that's technically our good bishop. We have all these other strategic factors in play, more space in the center, stronger king side. So now with bishop to g5, we develop that bishop with the tempo on the queen. And it's also trying to trade off that bishop, right? So if this knight wants to get developed, we now guard all three of its squares. So the most common move for black is actually to just play bishop to e7, allowing us to have this trade of bishops, which would get rid of our dark square bishop. But we don't have to do it right away. So what are we recommending here?
Uh, yep, so instead we can just reinforce the bishop with knight to f3. And we could take, but it doesn't really give us anything. So we'll just kind of reinforce with our knight. After knight d7, here we have a couple options. So we could go knight c3, but it's not exactly in line with what we want to do with the position in both in other lines and kind of long term in this position. So we're going to recommend knight b to d2. So looking for maybe these pawn storm ideas. if the pawn is on, or sorry, if the knight is on c3, we're blocking our own c pawn, which is kind of unfortunate. So after queen b6, we can castle. And uh, what happens if they take our knight here or take our bishop here?
We can play knight takes back on g5. And the way to remember to keep our bishop on g5 and not take on e7 is that black would love to just have us take so they can take back with their knight and get it developed. This knight is a problem piece for black. They don't really want to bring it to h6, but they also don't want to take our bishop, allowing knight takes g5 back. It's kind of an odd position for black. They have trouble getting the g8 knight in the game. So here, let's look at queenside castle. And then, like Jesse mentioned, this is a very strong idea in these lines. We are castled opposite sides. We need to get our pawns rolling against their king. Pawn to c4, and now our attack is coming. We have the king side on as much of a lockdown as we can, right? Look at this control of the dark squares. And now we're trying to break open the queen side and play with either a tactical attack on the queen side or a positional advantage where we're kind of controlling all areas of the board.
Yep. So after c4, let's look at the most common move, f6. And again, we could take, but I like keeping attention a little bit and dropping back with the bishop, bishop f4. Look at that idea. Strong bishop here. So if they take, we can actually take back with the bishop first. Why do we take with the bishop here and not the knight?
Yeah, so that's still our bad bishop. It's worse than the knight. So, like, if we had an option of which piece we want sitting here, we would rather have the knight sitting there. So we take with the bishop first and say, okay, go ahead and take our bishop if you want it, which is the most common move, because now we land this knight into e5. And look at this, knight to f7 is a threat, knight to g6 is possibly a threat. Um, this is just a really strong outpost, and it's not very easy for black to deal with it. And I should mention the reason black played f6 a couple of moves ago is because they wanted to get a kingside attack going, right? So they couldn't just really sit on their hands for too long. They see our queenside play coming. That's why black tends to play f6 there.
And yep, so after we get our knight into the center, knight e5, black is finally free to develop their knight, so knight h6. And they are attacking our pawn at this point, so we need to be a little careful. We can start with c5, a tempo move that gains space on the queen side where we're going to want to be pushing these pawns. After the queen moves, now we need to do something about this knight. So let's move this pawn. So let's move our other knight over and defend the pawn. Anything to say about those last few moves?
No, nothing special. We are guarding h4 is the big idea. And let's just go a couple moves deeper. So let's look at rook h to f8. And here we're recommending pawn to b4, getting this pawn storm going on the queen side. We have a stockfish eval of plus 3.9. That's due to our attack and also how well our pieces are placed. What we'd like to do is play b5, push the a pawn up the board, bring the f rook over to the queen side, and go after this black king. That's the plan.
Yep. So it seemed like black castled a little bit prematurely on the queen side and kind of walked right into our pawn storm. So we're happy about that.
One thing I like about this line a lot too is back on move 14, black did all of that work on the king side to still have to play knight h6 anyways, when they probably wanted the knight coming more towards the center. I just find that kind of funny. Okay, so let's go back to move number 8. We just looked at knight to d7 in this position. Now let's look at knight to h6. So black more quickly trying to get developed on the king side. And when you see that, there is a chance that black will try to castle king side. So let's see what happens in this line.
Yep. So slight difference here, and we don't want to take this knight or anything. So if it looks like black is going kingside, we can instead develop our knight to c3. So because it becomes less likely that we're going to be able to use the c pawn as a kind of as a pawn pushing weapon. So after knight f5, finally getting their bad knight into the game, we're going to play g3, kind of a flexible move to keep our pawns kind of defending each other. Um, Knight d7, developing their other knight. And what are the last few moves here?
The line we look at is castling, but sometimes you can play king f1 and king to g2 in these lines. Another thing to keep in mind. So let's look at castling, and then we will give black kingside castling as well. Now we have this kind of cool move, knight to d1. And the plan is to play the knight to d3, countering that strong knight on f5. The eval is zero point 0.7 for white. And I think there's a couple of ways we could play this. We could actually go for a kingside attack, or we could go for gaining space on the queen side. Because we have this extra space in the center, it's actually a lot easier for us to shift king side, queen side, back and forth. We can really try to play on both flanks. Whereas black is a little bit more tied down. It's difficult for them to switch back and forth. So now, Jesse, let's go to move 7, and we will look at queen to b6. Okay, so right here, queen b6. We are recommending knight to d2. B2 pawn is hanging, but that would be very bad after rook b1 hitting the b7 pawn. So let's look at c5 and knight e7. And we could start with c5 first.
Yep. So I actually had queen takes b2 in a game, and I believe I won. I should have won because it's just a really good position, and it was fun to play. So let's welcome that by this, quote unquote pawn sacrifice that is just really a poison pawn. So after c5, we're going c4 and really breaking the whole center open. Look at all this pawn tension. Can be a little overwhelming, but all the complications work in our favor. So if they take here, we take with the knight with tempo. If they take here, we'll show you what to do. So looks like we're temporarily losing a pawn, but there's no way that black can hang on to it. So we're going to develop our knight, knight f3, knight gf3, I guess. And we're going to, our plan is to get developed quickly and not worrying about recapturing this pawn immediately, I should say. So after knight c6, castles, and what's next for us?
Now we are looking to play knight takes d4 back, as well as c takes d. But we do have to kind of watch for a scenario where we have an extra attacker on d4, of course. But because we're up on development and black has to take some time to get their king side out, all their pieces out on the king side, that will give us time to get this pawn back in the end. So let's look at knight to e7 for black. Now our recommendation is rook f to c1. Get in the rook on this c file, which is about to be an open file in just a couple of moves. And at this point, black cannot get the f8 bishop out easily. So the main move is actually a big mistake, knight to g6. It doesn't look like a big mistake at first glance, and I think it's something that our opponents could very easily play. How do we punish this move?
Yep, so this move gets punished very quickly. So we can take on d5, they take back, and we have a very handy move here, e6. And look, they can't take back because they dropped the knight, and they're going to have to allow us to take here with check, ruin their castling, and expose their king really bad. And we even have queen check coming, picking up the knight. So things went from normal to terrible very quickly.
And I like how it always comes out of like a closed center. When we sack a pawn, they take too many moves to grab that extra pawn, and then all of a sudden the position falls apart. So that's another one of these lines. We saw it in the French. Now we're seeing it in the Caro-Kann. And this is a 7 point stockfish advantage, which is really pretty
Crazy.
incredible. Yeah. All right, let's go now to move 8, and we will look at knight e7. So we just looked at c5. Now we look at knight e7. It's a passive move. It doesn't put a lot of pressure on us immediately. We can kind of go with a similar plan. Knight g to f3. We are still going to play c4, just not as quickly in the line we just looked at. Knight to f5, castle, knight d7, and here we go, c4. What do you think of this position?
Yep, it's looking good because again, it looks like Black is hoping to cast on the queen side. But more than that, our king is safe. Black's king is stuck in the middle, so that's always a pretty good, I guess, clue or hint that it's time to break in the center and just open up the position in general. So after c4, Black is gonna develop, bishop e7. And now is kind of the time to really start opening up the position. So black's king is still stuck in the center for one more move. Let's capture, capture, and bishop takes e7. So this is a nice move because it's forcing their knight to retreat. And once again, delaying castling, like as long as we can get him to delay castling.
Yeah, and one thing I wanted to mention about this position, if you had this position with the H pawns both back on their starting squares, that would benefit black. The reason for that is because in this end position, after we play rook c1, there's only one weakness in our structure, the pawn on d4. Our H pawn is not weak here because of the way our pawns are set up. There's no easy way for black to attack h4, whereas the h5 pawn is actually very weak if black castles because we have our queen and our knights that can get over here to attack it. So there's space advantage for white, only one potential weakness, the pawn on d4, but black cannot easily attack it. If those pawns were back, black is more likely to play f6 because you're not going to see like a quick queen coming into g6 and all the light squares being weak for black. So something to keep in mind. That's a very nice positional advantage. And Stockfish does say we are up one here. I think that's due to the space, mobility, and the king safety. And what's our plan here going forward?
Yes, so I think a good idea would be to double on the C file. So maybe rook, how do you even say that? Rook C, I guess it's just rook C3 and then rook AC1. And then kind of run our A and B pawns up the board. I was getting confused because I thought they were on the same rank and had to get all
I know.
fancy. And then we can do some knight repositioning as well. So the knight on D2 can maybe go F1 to G3 and pressure this weak H pawn, like Matt was saying.
Yeah, that pawn's going to be in some trouble for black, that's for sure. Okay, so now we looked at h5 when we first played h4. At this point, let's look at pawn to h6 for black. Not as strong as h5, but we have a similar idea. We're going to play bishop to d3, again, trying to trade off the light square bishops and playing with the space advantage.
Yep. So again, same type of idea. Black can't really retreat anywhere, so they're almost always going to take us, and we're going to take back. After e6, we no longer have the same plan as last time because the pawn is covering that square. So instead, we're going to play kind of a quieter move, c3, and we're going to be looking to play h5 in a lot of these lines and really clamp black down and gain that extra space. That h5 move is really annoying in a lot of positions I've found.
Right.
So
I was
sorry,
just
go
going to
ahead.
say c3 is a way to make that center solid so that we kind of
Mhm.
have the time to play a move like h5.
Yep. So after c3, we're going to look at knight d7 and c5. Let's start with knight d7. And as we just mentioned, we're going to h5 here with our pawn and just kind of like anchoring this pawn in. Like that's such an annoying pawn. Can't never really push past. And, you never want to do that. So nice move, h5. I always love playing that move in my chessable training.
Yeah, and it's going for this, what do you call this formation with the 4 pawns?
The bathtub.
The bathtub? It's going for the bathtub formation, F4, G5, and then maybe even F5, and just keep pushing those pawns up the board. Right, so let's give black the natural move C5, trying to create a pawn weakness on D4. Very common in the French and the Caro. Knight to E2 is our recommendation. I like this move because it's very flexible, right? We still keep this F pawn push in mind. We're not playing knight to F3. Also, we have rook left ideas to develop the rook. So kind of a cool little move, knight to E2. At this point, the most popular line is C takes D, C takes D, bishop to B4 check. And what we can do here is we can block with the knight, knight to D2. You might be wondering, why wouldn't we block with the bishop and try to trade our bad bishop off? The reason why is if black trades their bishop for the knight, our bishop is going to come to life on the dark squares. It's going to get onto this diagonal and start to cause some problems for black. And we would like to just kick this bishop out next. So that's why we put the knight on d2 and not the bishop here. We actually kind of want um, the dark bishop on the board still.
Yep, so black will continue developing, and like Matt just said, now we have this a3 move, and we're gonna keep our, our quote unquote bad bishop on the board, but it's gonna be a very good bishop, so we want to keep it around. And this is actually where this line ends off, and our plan is to castle. You can castle either side here, um, personal preference, and expand the pawns. So maybe if you castle queen side, expand these pawns. King side, you could probably still
That's
expand
what I
these
was
pawns.
thinking. Let's still go kingside. I mean, I want to expand the pawns on both sides. If you can safely do it, take full control of the position. I think that's the way to go. That's when your opponent's going to overreact and start to make some big mistakes. Now let's go to c5 on move 7. So here we just looked at knight to d7. Now we're looking at c5. Again, we're recommending knight to e2, so staying pretty consistent with that last variation. Puts the defender on d4, and we would still like to play h5. So let's say knight c6, h5. Now you can see black's pieces are a little bit tangled up here on the king side, right? How do they get both the g8 knight and the f8 bishop developed? There's no h6 square for the knight. The c pawn's still here, so this bishop only has the one square, right? They're both fighting over e7. So let's look at knight g to e7 for black.
Yep, and one thing that's nice, so black is clearly trying to go whatever square that is, knight
f5.
f5, knight f5, and we want to be able to kick it with g4. So instead of castling here and then we're playing g4 and exposing our king a little bit, we have a sneaky move, king f1. So bringing our king to safety, it looks just like a mouse slip, an
It really
OTB mouse
does.
slip. But it's exactly what we want. So after knight f5, we have g4, and now this knight has, it has this square. If it goes back here, then the bishop is just trapped. And so we're going to force the knight to a very awkward square where it can actually get trapped pretty easily without compromising our king safety more than we have to.
So this is a hard move to play for black, but let's look at it. Knight to h4. The knight looks like it's pretty much trapped. We're going to play knight to a3, heading to c2. And our long-term plan is to play the queen over to g3 and try to wrangle up the knight that way. After c takes d, we take back with the c pawn. Most popular move is bishop to e7. So I don't think black wants to take that knight on a3 because they actually want the bishop to try to save their knight on h4. Like they can stay with their bishop parked there for a while, keep that knight defended. Now we are recommending knight to c2. Here we have a 0.6 advantage according to the engine. I think it's due to the space and maybe the control that we have in the position. It feels like black is kind of hanging on by a thread, trying to defend that knight. What's our plan in this position in the next few moves?
Yeah, well, we need to get our bishop involved, so we can do maybe bishop d2 or bishop d2 to bishop c3. And then again, like Matt said, if this bishop goes away for some reason, we can trap the knight. So always keep that in your mind as well. And then we can maybe do a knight maneuver with this knight, knight e1, and maybe even knight g2, offering a knight trade.
So even though it's like the knight that's almost trapped out there on h4, if we eliminate it, we just go back to that nice position where we can play on both flanks again with easy connection between both sides of the board.
Yeah, and this knight, uh, we can't really trap it because it's defended so well. So it's not the end of the world trading it off. It's just like playing hope chess to just leave it on the board because it is controlling some key squares.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Now let's go back to move 3, e5. We looked at bishop to f5. That was 6 lines. We are going to give 4 lines to pawn to c5. Think based on the numbers, this doesn't quite deserve 40% of the chapter, but because we recommend in our Caro-Kann course, and I do think it's kind of growing in popularity, I really wanted to give this line some more respect. So we're giving it a full 4 lines. And my recommendation against it is to play knight to f3. It's the third most popular move at the club level. And we're actually going to try to play d takes c5 if black is not careful. So this is kind of a tricky line. It's actually a move that a lot of players play who maybe don't know theory in this line too, so it's a little bit misleading. Um, so after knight to c6, what are we gonna play here?
And yeah, here we can actually grab the pawn. So in our own course, we avoid this by instead of playing knight c6, we just take the pawn. So if black is going to allow us to grab the pawn, we're going to go for it, and it's not so easy to win it back. So you just have to be a little bit careful figuring out how to hang on to the pawn. So after d takes, bishop g4. This pawn is not attacked yet, so we can make a little bit of a preparation move. C3, looking to play b4.
So now let's give black pawn to e6. Natural move, trying to attack this pawn. In this position, b4 is playable, but our recommendation is actually a little bit more accurate. Bishop to e3. So we're developing a piece while still defending the c pawn. Now, black is going to want to win this pawn. So bishop takes f3 is the main move. Queen takes. Now knight takes e5. And I'm trying to read my notes here. 120 out of 125 games at the club level. Oh, played this line. Okay, knight takes
Yep.
e5. But we do have a clear advantage here with this cool move, bishop to b5 check. And after black brings the knight back, we're going to now blow open the center. So what's our move in this position?
Yep. So c4, and we're really just trying to put the pressure on these centerpieces. So they can't really push here because we could take, and we have a lot of pressure here, and we can maybe even win a rook in the corner. So c4 is a nice move to really just open up the position while black's king is still stuck in the middle.
Would you say we're trying to use some dynamite in the center?
Dynamite in the center? Is that a phrase?
Let's try to use
Oh,
c4.
c4. Oh, okay. I didn't even catch it.
All right,
We'll
so
cut it out, guys. Don't worry. We'll cut it out.
the most popular move, knight f6. Queen to f6 is actually the strongest move, but it was not found in 22 club level games. So we'll go with the popular move. Knight to c3 is our recommendation. We would like to queenside castle here, leaving our rook sitting on the d file against the black queen. Um, and we're likely to play c takes d5 as well. So what's your feel on the eval here and the imbalances involved?
I would say it's about plus 2.6 if I had to guess.
And what's the
I'm
reason?
just looking. Yeah, I'm just looking in the notes. I see plus 2.6. But yeah, it looks really nice. If we have a lot of pressure on the light squares, again, castling, we're going to line up nicely against the queen, and it looks like we're maybe even going to be able to win a pawn here, a central pawn. So we're also going to be castled at the end of that line, and black is still stuck in the middle. So a lot of play, and it looks like a fun position to play.
So now let's go to move 5, e6. All right, so we just looked at bishop g4 here. Now we're looking at e6, putting the immediate attack on this pawn on c5 that we just won. We're going to recommend, again, bishop to e3, keeping consistent. If queen a5 check is played, we can meet that with c3, and black isn't able to win the pawn because we have a quick b4 forking queen and bishop. Let's look at knight g to e7. And now we're recommending bishop to d3, which actually completely prevents knight to f5. If knight to f5 is played, just take it off the board. Give black those really bad pawns. So what is black going to do here?
Yeah, so this is a sneaky move because we're kind of playing like wait and see what black is going to do. So, like Matt just said, if they move the knight here, we just take, and they have a terrible pawn structure. If instead they play the more natural looking move, putting more pressure on this pawn, well, now we have now we can play like I don't even know like what kind of game was that? Like Red Rover, or something with your bishop. A little, I don't know. I'm butchering the phrase here, but you understand.
Send the bishop right over.
Yeah. Yeah. So now we can now we can pin this knight, and this pawn is no longer hanging. So we're kind of just like jockeying for position and like saying, where do you want to put your knight? And our bishop is doing a good job defending it, moving it a couple times, breaking a common rule of moving a piece twice in the opening.
And one of the reasons we do it is because we see black also moving their piece twice in the opening. That knight moved twice, and we don't want to allow them the capture on e5. That's the stronger pawn out of these two. So we tend to try to hold the e pawn. If we're going to give one up, it'll be the c pawn. So bishop e5 prevents their capture. Bishop to d7, most common reply, renewing the threat. Now we're actually going to voluntarily give up the bishop pair. That's also our good bishop. So again, we see this theme, give up the bishop pair and the good bishop, but it's when we get this control of the board. And that's what I want the course viewers to appreciate is this full board control that we're going for in both the French defense and the Caro-Kann chapters. We can now play bishop to d4. And in this particular position, not only do we have the full board control, we are also still up the one pawn, right? So it's on black now to figure out where does that compensation come from? Can they get their bishop pair active? Can they somehow win the pawn back or create some weaknesses? Because right now we are holding the pawns. Black has to figure something out.
Yeah, and if black plays a move like queen a5 check, we're okay with the queen trade here. We are up a pawn, and Matt, what's the rule of queen trades?
We go for it because we have a good chance to play for the win.
Yeah.
So let's give black queen takes. We are going to play the b knight captures back. We have a +1 stockfish eval here. We have that extra pawn. And I would say the reason the eval is right at +1 is because there's no compensation for the pawn, right? Like you maybe could say bishop pair. You maybe could say we have double pawns as positives for black. But we do have the extra space as positives for white and the knights that you could argue are a little better than the bishops with a closed position. So +1 advantage. What's our plan here in the next few moves?
Yeah, so what we want to do is castle, probably kingside, but I think queenside looks okay here as well. And then just develop our pieces. So maybe if we go kingside here, can bring our rook over, rook fe1, go b4 and put another defender on the pawn. Um, Maybe after b4 we go knight b3 and really just defend our pawns. Maybe even h4 and start this pawn storm on the queen side.
You know, this reminds me a little bit of the Note Boom chapter from our dynamic Slav course, where you get those queenside pawns rolling.
Yeah.
In this case, we're playing it from the other side, but it's very similar type of theme. Kind of lock up the center and try to push the queenside pawns. All right, we had two lines left, and now we are looking at move 4 deviations. In the last line, we will look at the chess goals repertoire against our e4 repertoire. Earl repertoire against e4 repertoire. But first, before we get to that, bishop to g4. What are we going to do here?
Yeah, we can still take this pawn. So I think we're going to take this pawn every time they offer it to us. And it is not easy to hang on to, or sorry, it's not easy to to capture back as we've seen in these other lines. So let's take the pawn and try to hang on to it. After e6, now they're attacking the pawn, and we have an annoying move that we insert here, and that's bishop b5 check. After black plays e6, they cut off their bishop from coming back, and so we can play bishop b4 check. Black is going to block with the knight, or maybe they bring the knight here. But either way, we can play b4 here, and the knight is pinned. So we can support this pawn with our b pawn.
This is actually a better version of the 4 knight to c6 line. And in this case, none of our pawns fall, and we have the comfortable space advantage. So this is looking very good. The main move for black is knight to e7. If a5 is played there trying to hit this pawn, we actually have a nice reply. Pawn to c3, ready to capture back. So after knight to e7, we are recommending to castle kingside. And here we're making good progress with our development, and black is going to be a little bit slower getting developed. Excuse me, and they're still down a pawn. So what we would like to do here is knight b to d2, rook e1, bishop b2, and expand on the king side again. And that bishop is going to be a little bit uncomfortable out there on g4.
So after black attacks the pawn, we need another defender here. Bishop b2. Notice that they really only have one attacker here, so we can take back with the bishop because this knight is still pinned. knight e7, and then knight bd2, completing our development. And we have, so the eval here is already +2, which is crazy. So we have this extra pawn and really nothing at all to show for it for black. And this development is pretty sad too. Not really active pieces.
And I'd like to expand, like A3, solidify this, but then I want to go H3, G4, knight D4, pawn F4. Let's start expanding kingside, lock down the queen side, and maybe eventually we'll play a move like C4, eliminate our double pawn, and then in the end game we do have this extra pawn that will, in combination with our kingside play, be a pretty nice advantage. All right, one line left. We get the chess goals repertoire. Chess goals on chess goals. C takes D4. I'm recommending this move that's been very popular at Grandmaster level lately. Queen takes D4. We can't capture on C5 like we've seen in some of the other lines. So what I want to go for is Queen takes D4, and I actually just want to play for a very small advantage. So I considered looking at lines where we play other things like a quicker C4 instead of knight F3. But actually, the reason I went with knight F3 on the previous move is because of this line. I really like just playing for the small advantage here, and I think on all the other lines we have even larger advantages. So this should kind of secure an advantage no matter what.
And after queen takes d4, black is very likely going to take their tempo, knight c6. And when I first saw this move, queen f4, I thought it looked a little goofy, but it's nice because it does take away these really nice squares for the bishop. The queen defends these, and so it's just a nice way to remember. It's going to take away these good squares. The bishop isn't really happy anywhere, so nice move, queen f4. I thought I would just point that out. Um, After e6, black voluntarily blocking in their bishop. We can play knight c3, knight ge7, and bishop d3 here. This is one I get wrong all the time.
So our plan is to play H4, and we want to castle kingside. And we're just trying to cramp black's position a little bit. And we do have like a maybe up to half a pawn advantage for white. I think zero point 0.3 is what Stockfish says. And we want to kind of encourage black to make a mistake from an uncomfortable and passive position. After bishop to d3, knight g6, main move. It's the queen, it's the pawn on e5. We can tuck the queen back on g3. And now we start to see that black is just getting in a little bit of trouble in terms of getting their pieces developed. Let's look at bishop to b4. A small mistake, but the most common move. So what are we going to do here?
Yeah, so it's a move that I spent a lot of time trying to figure out, and that's h4, because it looks like black can just play d4 here, and our knight is trapped. But we're going to go we'll cover that in a little bit. So we want to go h4 and expand on the king side. We're looking to play h5 and either castle or just play king f1 and maybe rook lift the rook or something. So is that other things we want to go over for the plan here? Um,
I think that pretty much covers it. This
okay.
c3 knight can come back to e2 and out to d4 once our king is castled or we play king f1. We are sitting at a point or a +2 advantage. So let's look at that line quick, Jesse, with d4. Our response is going to be a3. And how does black continue their pressure? Like, what moves do you feel would be strong for black here?
Yes, so the normal move I think would just be to move back, but then we can press forward and they kind of lose their thread. So maybe move like queen a5, giving the bishop, and we can take here, but this pawn is pinned. So take, and we're gonna have to do something with our knight, and also our bishop is hanging. So knight e2 is the only move here. And so if we take count of the material in this line, we're actually down an exchange
And a pawn
um,
now.
and a pawn. But I guess the point is here at the end, we can play h5, and now our queen is getting in. So
Right.
maybe it's not so simple.
And this is maybe a line that we should show in the PGN file now that I'm looking at it. But this is a nice advantage. We are still up here. After queen takes g7, we do have the threat of queen takes h8 check. We do have the bishop b5 check idea. I think it's most likely that black is going to snap this bishop off. After c takes d, probably queen a5 check. I know we're getting really deep into this line. I don't think you need to memorize the 17 moves deep, but if you calculate out the tactics, we are coming out ahead in this position. We have a nice attack. Black still has trouble getting their last pieces developed. Our rook can lift up, and everything is kind of pointing to the center and the king side. So we are still looking at around a 2-point advantage. But this is definitely one that you'll want to play around with a bit and make sure that you're comfortable on this line. Because it's ChessGoals on ChessGoals Repertoire. If you're playing in the ChessGoals classical events, you might see this line or something very similar at least.
Yeah, we'll have to get some of our ChessGoals members to play this line against each other. It'll be a fun one to analyze.
Yeah. All right, so that's line 10 of the Caro-Kann chapter. That's the final line. Stay tuned. Next chapter, we will go over one of Jesse's favorite past openings, the Scandinavian defense.
Yeah, that's right. So I played the Scanny for a long time, switched to the Caro-Kann. So let's compare and contrast what we get from white against those two chapters.
All right, see you in the next chapter, guys.